I was working in FC Rad, which is a football club here in Belgrade, and I like this. There are a few situations in training that's they stick in your head. Like I can remember them years back. It's like revelation. So we had this warm up with maybe 20 athletes. So we did dynamic stuff, like the usual stuff, butt kicks and A skip, big skip, all this stuff, and then we finished with a tag drill. And then we finish with, we call it handball drill. It's like playing maybe 10v10 with a ball. You can catch the ball only in the air. And, to score a goal, you need to head it to the goal. And it created a really, really fun atmosphere. And then, the head coach stopped this drill and continued doing, dry and boring passing drills. And the assistant coach came to me and said, "Did you notice something?" He's like, "No." And he goes like, "Yeah, but we progress the workout really nicely. We enter in this really playful mindset where people actually take risk, learn, try the new things, and then we break it and then we continue drilling. And this is bad." And I was like, stick to my head for like years now. So I think, we need this play element inside the gym.
That was physical preparation coach and sports scientist Mladen Jovanović speaking on the importance of free-flow, play-based work in context in the preparation of team sport athletes. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Simply Faster. Simply Faster is an online athletic performance technology shop distributing items such as the Freelap timing system, GymAware, K-Box, 1080 Sprint, and the SpeedMat. I've gotten many of these items from Simply Faster and can confidently say that they make today's best training technology available to everybody. The Freelap timing system has revolutionized both my practices and my athlete assessments, allowing me to look at the 10-meter fly capability of dozens of athletes in a matter of seconds. It is wireless, compact, portable, and incredibly versatile. The K-Box and 1080 Sprint are fantastic tools for any coach looking to build speed, agility, and implement training scenarios that go beyond the traditional weight room. The 1080 Sprint is being used by great coaches training some of the fastest sprinters in the world, and it truly represents high-performance speed training. I can personally attest that Simply Faster's customer service is second to none. Christopher at Simply Faster responds quickly to queries, and anyone who makes a purchase from Simply Faster is in good hands. If you want to acquire some of the best high-tech training equipment available, stop by simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. They are the future of coaching technology. Welcome to episode 106 of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks for being here today. And we have on the show sports scientist, physical preparation professional, Mladen Jovanović. He is one of the foremost thinkers in the physical preparation, athletic preparation field today, and particularly in the arena of building the best possible training programs for team sport athletes. If you've been around Mladen's site, you've probably heard the term building a robust athlete, robust training programs. And he brings in the work of many of the world's great philosophers and thinkers in the process. And that's something that I've always really loved, respected. I try to do myself, is going outside the field to gain more insight to the field itself. So things like Dan, do you hear that a lot with like Dan John and how he'll relate? Back in a few episodes ago with the 4 F's, food, friendships, family, and finance, and how we can learn from each of those and bring it back into the field. And so I always enjoy talking to people who are always bringing things full circle and putting things in my own head or planting those seeds that really help me to think more every time I'm writing a program or carrying out a training session. And so a little bit more about Mladen's background as well. He is the owner of complementarytraining.net and has worked with a variety of elite level sports in countries including Serbia, Sweden, Qatar, Turkey, Australia, and the USA. And Mladen is also finishing up a PhD dissertation on velocity-based training, which he'll be speaking about today. So I've been looking forward to having him on the show for some time, And I know this is a guy who's in demand. If you listen to podcasts, he's a frequent guest. And in a way, I'm always trying to get different guests. But I knew I had to get Mladen on the show. If you read his work on complementary training, just a really intelligent guy, blends a lot of things together, and a guy that I've been meaning to sit down and talk to for some time. And one of the things that really has been drawing my attention lately is his writings on mental heuristics, and which would be a mental shortcut, the way that we think and how sometimes we create shortcuts in our brain that can lead us to write a particular training program. So he's writes on that and those ideas. And so that was one of the things that really drew me in for this podcast. But really, which I wrote a lot of in creating this show, I actually wrote him a lot of like super loaded questions in that arena. We actually ended up talking into probably a more honestly practical for you coaches out there who didn't want this to become a giant sports psychology episode, but or human psychology episode, I should say. But we really went into some big time practical thoughts on one of my all time favorite and very near and close to my heart topics right now, which you heard about in the teaser, which is free play versus a canned drilled session. And obviously things aren't black and white. It's not like, for a pro athlete, it's not like go in the gym and just do whatever you want and play and have fun. There are certain things that need to be done in the field. There's certain KPIs and there's certain things that we need to be pushing towards. But at the same time, after being in strength and conditioning, physical prep for some time myself, I realized that sessions where it's just an hour worth of do this, everything's internally cued. There's no free flow, no play. Things in terms of the stimulation to the athlete and getting them to move the way that their body has intended to through who knows how long of developments and instincts and this primal ability driven by the subconscious mind that's the most amazing supercomputer we have. There's a balance. There's certain amounts of each, and obviously it's the art of coaching. But Mladen's going to give some awesome talk on how free play and free flow fits into that, and the idea too of canned and free flowing versus canned and planned, I guess you could say. It goes into everything, and Mladen's going to share his insight as well in planned periodization versus a more free-flowing and robust periodization that caters to the needs of team sport athletes. Also, Mladen's going to share a little bit of his thoughts and ideas on velocity-based training, what are some of the different uses, and alluding a little bit to some of the things that he's working on in his PhD without giving it all away. So always great to sit down and talk with minds like Mladen, and I think you guys are going to get a lot out of this episode. Let's get on to the show. Mladen, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks a lot, Joel. I'm a big fan of your podcast and listened to a few episodes, and it was, fantastic conversation. So I'm happy to be part of this fantastic show. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, well, thanks for being here. It's same likewise. I've been following your stuff for a while, so it's good to see your face and actually talk for the first time. It's almost like this podcast has been an excuse on my end to do so, or like at least a motivator. So super excited to chat today. What's been new recently? I know you moved back to Serbia and been traveling a little bit. And what's good in the life of Mladen Jovanović?
So I moved back from Australia 2016. I got divorced, so I moved back. Pretty much, I didn't see my son for a few months, and I started going depressed and a bit crazy, so I couldn't sleep and things like that. Although the job, I was at Port Adelaide, it was fantastic, and they showed fantastic support for my, I would say, issues. So I moved back to be closer to my son, and since then I started doing a PhD. So I just a few days ago I actually defended the PhD project. So it's like a formal thing. Is just announce the potential thesis in front of the. It's publicly defended, so people can come over and in front of the commission. So I just did that a few days ago. It's going to be on a velocity-based stuff. So yeah, last 2 years I've been traveling like crazy. Got myself a motorcycle. It's like a middle-age crisis. Hit me really soon. So yeah, I'm learning how to drive and enjoying life and freedom pretty much. So yeah, it's pretty much PhD. I finished the book, so I'm waiting for the final phases of the edit. and I hoping to be available in maybe before August. So let's keep the fingers crossed. So it's a book about the high intensity interval training, and it touches about agile periodization and some of my, I would say, planning stuff inside as well. So it's multiple projects. And last year we also we developed the app called the Athlete SR, which is a web app for. It's pretty much for the scheduling, the calendar. It's really flexible calendar and survey builder. So it's really easy to collect stuff like session RP or wellness questionnaire or anything you want to design, besides being really good team calendar. So it's a lot of stuff. And to be honest, lately I'm contemplating about going back into coaching. But the funny thing is, like, I will prefer to be in a like a management position rather than having like SSC or sports scientist position. So something like overseeing the process, getting involved when needed, but try to oversee the whole stuff. And these positions are really rare, and it's really hard to get in a decent position. Although I will probably accept the cleaning lady position as well. So, but yeah, it's I would say it's a good life. I see my son, and I'm free. So I'm been writing, and this summer is going to be pretty much a lot of writing the thesis and the papers. So yeah, honestly, I don't regret moving back from Australia. Although I loved it, but it's many more benefits. Family comes first.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I like what you said about the motorcycle. I feel like you're living my life in reverse. I had a motorcycle. I had a motorcycle, and then got married, and then I had kids, and I had to get rid of the motorcycle. It's a little expensive here in California for it anyways. But then you had a kid, and now you bought a motorcycle. So I'm a little bit jealous of you, to be honest. I'd love to have that back.
Yeah, it's a good life. I would say can't make any negative stuff. Besides it's a risky activity, but I'm not going crazy. I'm not that young, and I have a kid, and I have a cruiser, so it's like it's a nice ride rather than sporting ride and risky stuff. So enjoying the ride.
Yeah, I think if I would have thought if I get a motorcycle again, which I'd love to, it's definitely got to be a cruiser, and I should probably pay to get like a factory speed limit installed, like to like 75 or something, because otherwise like with my old bike, it's like, oh, I have to see how fast this goes. It's it's just in my blood. So
what did you have before? Did you have a super bike or sport bike or
enduro
or what?
Oh, my old boss made fun of me. It was just like an 83 Honda. What was it? Just like a 500cc, like a little cruiser. But it wasn't that fast. It was like a good beginner bike. It was enough for me not to kill myself. I just rode that like razor's edge for a few years and made it out alive. So, yeah, it was perfect. I was gonna say too, you Mladen, you must be the only PhD, and congrats on that, by the way, who mentions who's mentioned like velocity based stuff. Very informal. Just here it is, just kind of throwing it out there. But I do appreciate that. You got to keep it pragmatic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot of scientists fall in love with the stuff, and they defend that stuff, whatever it takes, and they're in that stuff for like ages, and it's their thing, it's their brainchild, and they're falling in love with that. I'm really kind of agnostic about stuff, so I might come across as a proponent of the velocity-based training, which we pretty much we wrote I would say pretty decent review for Australian Strength Conditioning Journal, me and Eamon Flanagan, and it set a good starting point for other papers, although it's not the best journal to publish. I mean, it's a good S&C journal. It's not academic journal. But, lately I'm and being in Qatar and all this, technology and monitoring all this stuff, I just, said, fuck it. I think it's coaching, art of coaching and intuition. It's more important. And actually, our PhD, mine and my co-author, Ivan Jukic from Zagreb, we try to, like, we did our best to validate some of the stuff, metrics or approaches using velocity-based training. We try to validate it, and we saw it's not that clear, it's not that straightforward. There are still errors. It's like trying to predict how many reps in reserve you have from velocity. It's tricky. It's not that easy, and I think don't fall for that stuff too early. It's too early, and I think we still need to rely on intuition and art of coaching, pretty much. So, and yeah, I'm trying not to fall in love again. I might shift stuff. I'm trying to be really pragmatic rather than like I'm a VBT guy. It's like in 5 years it's probably not going to be as big as it is now. So then you try to grab it, like try to hold it, and I don't think that's the right way. And besides, I would say that's more scientific, because all the stuff we do, and all the stuff I write, and all the stuff I would say blog about, I try to break it myself. So rather than try to find support for a certain hypothesis, I use this falsification as proposed by Popper. I try to break it, I try to break all these theories from multiple attacks, and if it holds those attacks, then it's probably viable. So it's probably closer to the truth. And most of these really, really complex stuff, it's once you start in attacking it and dissolving it, then you end up with a really simple stuff. For example, the periodization, all these fancy periodization schemes, it might be only variation. So rather than anything, fancy specific sequence you need to follow. So it might be only, okay, you need to focus on one thing for some time, then you switch it. That's it. So it's like a minimal complexity. So it's like Occam razor. So what's the least complex explanation of what's happening? And I think that's the most robust theory. If you try to attack it from different, you're gonna strip all this complexity, and you're gonna end up with something that's really, really simple.
Yeah, I like the idea. And as long as I've been a coach too, it's just like trying to. I think we all start there, right? Like you mentioned periodization, like the big fancy scheme and the year plan and what, or even like a 3-month plan or whatever. And I think there is that fancy scheme that we roll out. At the end of the day, I know you're a big Dan John guy. You mentioned like the park bench workouts and the bus bench workouts and those types of things. And one of the Dan John things that's always stuck with me, like I literally think about it probably every year at some point, is the idea of like when you set a personal best. I know Dan's a track guy, or I'm sure, many ways to validate what a personal best is, but like it probably wasn't at the tail end of like this perfect big long year plan. It just kind of happened when you weren't even, as an athlete, you weren't even really thinking about what you were doing. It just all kind of happened and came together. And I always go back to that, like in myself, even I work with some coaches who really don't have that plan, but yet they get really good results. And so I just think that's the whole periodization thing is always an interesting question. It's cool to see a lot of people talking about it too, you and John Kiley and people kind of hitting it from the philosophical angle too, because I think you have to inject philosophy into that to really steer the ship in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree completely. And actually, I mentioned that story by Dan John multiple times. But I came to a similar conclusion with working with team sports. So most of the head coaches, at least in Serbia, they don't have a faculty background. Or, I mean, they might have a faculty background, some other faculty, but not many doing kinesiology or faculty of sports. And coming as an educated S&C, and I had this, nice laid out plan for like a whole year. And these guys, they're like free flowing every day. It's like, oh, maybe we should do this, maybe we should try that. And I remember back in the day when I started, 2007, I said back in the day is like I've been coaching for 40 years, like, which is not the case. So when I started, I look at these coaches and I said, these fucking morons, like they don't have any plan. They're like, what the hell are they doing? But now I'm like, okay, they I think they were more agile than us. So just because you have a plan doesn't mean you are, foolproof or you are a good coach. And but on the other side, if you're like I'm not gonna not gonna break balls of CrossFit, but if you're just doing random stuff, then it's the on the other side of the extreme. So something that's, I would say, you appreciate the randomness, you appreciate the day-to-day changes, but you also have a big picture in mind. Like these are the objectives you want to achieve, but then you're like flexible within those bucket that constraint. So rather than trying to squeeze everything in a shallow space, like these are the progressions we're gonna do for like a year and things like that. So yeah, it's the same thing. And now when I'm older, I wanted to do more sports. Like I wanted to we play soccer sometimes. It's indoor soccer like futsal, and I just really enjoy like you just go and play. It's like when you were younger, you were under pressure to succeed. It's like you need to succeed, and you have a pressure by the coaches and all this stuff. Now you just enjoy sports. And as you mentioned, the Dungeon story as well. Like I think he hit the personal best in a discus throw once he retired, because he just enjoyed the process. There's no pressure to achieve, and then you just relax and go with the flow, and then you bam hit the personal best. So I think there's a lot to it. We just create this artificial pressure too much. So maybe something to talk about in this episode or any other. But yeah, really interesting topic.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, that's something that I'll just switch my questions around a little bit, and I'm actually happy to do so. That you kind of touched on that point, is like the bus bench and the park bench. I know you've talked about it in other podcasts, but I've thought about that. Like I feel like the longer I've been a coach, the greater and greater percentage of my workouts has become more the park bench. A good friend of mine, Paul Cater, who coaches down in about 2 hours down south of me in Monterey Salinas and does work with the Orioles. Like this kind of came full circle. I did a workout with him, and it's just like the whole first of the hour, the whole first 45, 50 minutes was honestly just messing around. Like him coming up with this stuff on the spot, like basically a 50-minute warm up that's like dynamic and all different, and doing stuff to music or different sprint drills or just chucking a basketball at each other as fast as you can or whatever. At the end of that, I felt awesome. And then the last 15 minutes is just, I guess, the bus bench, the main set of the day, and then that's it. And it really has changed just going through that and seeing how I felt and just kind of thinking about a lot of things. I'm like, this is a lot closer to the training that I did in many cases in ways and when I was setting my bests than when I try to really put everything in all these boxes, and a lot of those boxes are too much max strength work anyways. And it's changed. It's been a game changer. So I'd love it if you expand a little bit on that and your own experiences.
Yeah, I think you touch on a good stuff. So I think we are missing this play element in training, and I can make a few examples. So, and also the thing you mentioned is doesn't need to be black or white. So you can have a certain part of the workout that's being strict. Maybe exercise or two. This is, I would say, bus bench. This is it. This is these are the amount of sets you're doing. This is the exercise you're doing. But then on the second part of the workout, it could be more playful. So it could be say, okay, you choose, maybe a single leg exercise, maybe choose the upper body pulling exercise, and just try to go from 5 reps to 15 reps per set, something like that, or just say maybe accumulate 30 to 50 or even 100 reps total, and then you're just playing. Maybe today I saw this new exercise on a Instagram. I want to try it. So why not? As long as you are, doing the big rocks, in quotation mark first, or they are being done in training. So then you can have this, wiggle room to play. Other thing is like this play stuff. And one, I was working in FC Rad, which is a football club here in Belgrade, and I like this. There are a few situations in training that's they stick in your head. Like I can remember them years back. It's like revelation. So we had this warm up with maybe 20 athletes. So we did dynamic stuff, like the usual stuff, butt kicks and skip, big skip, all this stuff. And then we finished with a tag drill. And then we finish with we call it handball drill. It's like playing maybe 10v10 with a ball. You can catch the ball only in the air, and to score a goal, you need to head it to the goal. And it created a really, really fun atmosphere. And then, the head coach stopped this drill and continued doing, dry, I would say dry and boring passing drills. And the assistant coach came to me and said, "Did you notice something?" He's like, "No." And he goes like, "Yeah, but we progressed the workout really nicely. We enter in this really playful mindset where people actually take risk, learn, try the new things, and then we break it, and then we continue drilling. And this is bad." And I was like, stick to my head for like years now. So I think, yeah, we need this play element inside the gym. But the thing is, like, strength training is not the stuff where you fuck around too much, especially if you're in team sports. And I think that's the reason why team sport dislike, at least in soccer in Europe, they dislike lifting, because it's dry and boring. It's like, when you're on a pitch, you play around with your teammates, you try tricks, you try to make fool of someone, something like that. But then you go in the gym and it's like dry and boring. And you probably notice the European style lifting in soccer when they do a bosu stuff, and they do it mostly because it's more fun and it's more culture. But if you try to make them squat, it's boring. It's like you need to kind of sneak in. You need to be a snake to sneak in the hard work somehow without making a clash with the athletes. So you can be the best SNC in the world. You come into soccer, it's a different culture. You need to understand that culture, and you need to slowly sneak in the hard, heavy stuff. And I know a few SNCs from USA coming to Europe or coming to Asia, and they come with the American mindset, and it didn't work. So they had a lot of clash with the athletes. And, for example, on Thursday we do deadlifts because it's written in a book, and it doesn't work. So I think, again, I come back to this art of coaching is we need to bring this playfulness inside the lifting. So it doesn't need to be, fucking around on a bosu ball, but it should have certain elements of, playful activity once you hit the, big rocks.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I think there could be you could roll with it to that point, like you said, the Euro soccer football players who they wanted everything to be play, and there does need to be those big rocks in the program. And I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, the idea of you also being able to do that first. Like I mentioned, my friend Paul does the long warm up and then hits some big rocks, or doing the big rocks first and then going into some play. And like you mentioned, and that example of just altering the skill and the athletes are having fun walking out of the weight room, I just think it's so underrated. Like I think about dopamine and our neurochemistry and how our body processes a workout in terms of stress and recovery. And I can't really think of anything better sometimes than walking out of the weight room like with a smile on your face, and that was awesome. And I had this learning experience on top of lifting heavy weights, and being able to mix those together in a way that it's about the process, and I think about flow too, and how do we create flow throughout the whole workout, not just I don't know, during the Olympic lifts, if you like Olympic lifting or whatever. Well, those are just awesome things to think about and consider.
Yep, I agree. As I said earlier, it's tricky to do it in strength training, but I don't think it's impossible to do it. I think there are different strategies you might use. You might, as mentioned before, you might have a boring part, maybe 2 times 20 minutes, where you do the stuff that's boring and important, and then you do this interesting stuff. But then you can also have a superset, maybe one, you do a lower body heavy lift, and then you do some upper body funny, I would say funny thing, but something that's new, or you try to vary it across the season. And that's another thing, it's boredom. So you probably know yourself as an athlete, you can't stay on the same program forever. It's like, it's boring. It's still probably working, but it just gets boring. You're not looking forward to it, and it might affect whatever. It might affect the hormones, or CNS, neurochemistry, or whatever, but it's boring. So maybe we should have those big rocks, and once you finish them, then you do the fun stuff. It's like once I got a kid, I realized all these tricks work on them. It's like, okay, do your stuff first, and then you're gonna play. It's like, no, I don't want to do it. It's like, okay, if you do your stuff now, you're gonna do a double play later. So what do you prefer? It's like, okay, I'm gonna clean my room now, and then I'm gonna play iPad for like 10 minutes or 20 minutes rather than 10. So it's something like that. So I think it works with everyone. Like, do your homework first, and then I'm gonna go around, with my friends. So it's same thing in strength training. So it's not really that different.
I love that. I'm laughing because I have a 2-year-old. I'm just thinking about her and dinner time. But it actually makes so my friend Paul too with the big long warm up before. That's here. I feel like here in America where everyone just wants to get to the heavy lifting, right? And we don't play enough, and everything's coached. Versus in Europe maybe where like they would rather play than do the heavy lifting and selecting the first thing in the workout based off the cultural context too. That seems like an interesting concept. It certainly makes sense to me.
Yeah, it can be taken to the negative extreme. Everybody's not lifting or just fucking around in the gym, and I think that's the extreme we have nowadays in Europe in most of the clubs. But then again, most of these guys are playing a lot of games, and they are already developed athletes. So not sure how many performance improvement with these guys you can get in the gym. And I know this might get some people furious, but I think the point of the gym work with these guys is mostly making them robust rather than, making them stronger or jump higher. It's just making sure that, you create a robust athlete that can withstand the playing stress you get from high level competition. So it's frequent, it's long, and what's the best thing you can do is to make sure they are available for the coach to do the skill sessions and games. So, make them strong enough. So make them strong enough to kind of support and have this. That's why I like Dan John armor building. So you're building an armor rather than making them faster in the gym or something like that. So I think that's another viewpoint to look at the process.
Oh, right on. That's really come full circle for me in working with a sport like tennis, which regardless if it's America or Europe or anywhere, I think the generality is almost always the same as the tennis players don't really like lifting heavy that much. And I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm like, yeah, that's like my job is to make you injury proof and robust way more than I care about how fast you run a 505 or a 10-yard dash over. I mean, I want you to do that better, but my priority with that group much more than getting. I mean, I think it validates us sometimes, especially I was a track guy, so I want to see you jump higher. Cool, but I realized look, it doesn't really matter unless you're on the court. So we still lift, but a lot of our time is more spent actually doing like the Jay Schrader extreme isometrics, and those guys get fired up about that stuff too. They do it in a group, they get way more out of it, and they'll work harder. And I'm like, cool, yeah. Like let's do this. Like this is great.
Yeah, I think with all these examples, there are positive sides and negative sides. One of the negative sides of taking this stance of protecting from the downside is alibi coaching. So you're just doing something that they can do and whatever, but they're not improving, but you're coaching. And you can always call it armor building and things like that. So I think it's a fine balance between, I would say, adapting to, their needs and also trying to push them forward. And that's why I say it's an art of coaching that's more important than any numbers or anything.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I agree. I do think that it's definitely an art that you kind of, each group's a little different, and each population. I was going back to, I wanted to circle back just a little bit to mention too on like I guess we talk about like playing around. And I guess that's kind of I don't know if that's the right like word for it in many contexts. Like you mentioned the idea of like a menu system or just saying I want you to get X number of reps in, which is it's structured, but it's not just necessarily like just play, do whatever you want. Like I was thinking about, I had a conversation with Jay DeMeo over at Richmond a couple of years ago. His team was having the best season they'd ever had, and we were just talking about in-season training a little bit. And I don't want to misquote him, but I think it was something like, we aren't really doing much of anything in season right now. It's just the guys come in and you have to do 75 total reps of TRX row push-ups and pull-ups or something like that and feel good and then leave. And I was like, cool. Like that's, it's just like there's a little bit of a menu to it. And that always stood out to me in terms of, yeah, it's like you don't just go in here and do whatever, but there is a structure to it, but there's also a little bit of personal autonomy.
I think it also depends who you're working with. And working in soccer, if you give them too much wiggle room, they're going to use it in a negative way. So they're going to not do stuff. So you need to find a fine balance between giving them freedom and asking for, I would say, strict training. So it's art of coaching in finding what's the best way. So if you have a responsible athletes, and then you can say, do the I don't know, whatever, lifting, accumulate 50 reps in upper body rows. They're gonna use some actual weights. That makes sense. They're gonna try to push themselves a little bit. But if you're working with athletes who don't give a damn, they might use like a pink dumbbells or whatever, just get the reps in. So again, it's tricky. There's no recipe that's worked for everyone, and you need to find it that suits your own team.
Yeah, no, right on. I like the examples too from, I think my populations, not all of them are generally, and maybe it's just in America too, are very motivated to lift weights and max weights, which is awesome. It makes my job easier. But you don't think about and you hear about it in pro sports a lot too. I hear it from like NBA strength coaches where they have the precedent of not really wanting to lift or do that type of thing as often. And so it's good to hear those examples on my end to think about just the different options and coaching mindsets that might come with that. I wanted to actually go back. You were talking a little bit about velocity-based training and your PhD work, and I'd love it if you could expand a little bit on that and some of the things you're finding and some practical guidelines for coaches in terms of bar speed monitoring.
So, without uncovering the secrets and the details of my findings. So for the listeners, the velocity-based training is the approach of using velocity to prescribe training. So, and it's based on the assumption and actually prerequisite that you lift during the concentric range as fast as possible. So, for example, if you if you start with a 20% of 1 RM and then proceed to 100% and then measure velocity of the first rep, you're gonna get this nice and pretty reliable load velocity profile. So it's really linear. It's the heavier the weight, the slower you're gonna lift it, and so forth. And the funny thing, or I would say one of the hypotheses is that if your 1 RM improves. So, for example, you go from 100 kilos bench press. For example, that might be lifted at 0.16 meters per second. And, for example, your 80% might be lifted at, I'm just going to bomb the numbers, maybe like 0.4 meters per second. And then you increase that 1 RM to 120 kilos. The velocity at 120 kilos is going to be, within margin of error of that 0.18 or 16, whatever I've said, meters per second. And same thing for 80%. So it's going to still be around 0.4 meters per second, and this makes it quite usable because you can use velocity to prescribe rather than using a pre-cycle 1 RM to prescribe training. And also it takes into account day-to-day variation. So if you're feeling, down on a certain day, velocity at 80% is gonna be same. I would say same, but I would say less variable than the weight. So maybe 80% on a given day might be 80 kilos, or one day might be 85 kilos. But if you take velocity, then you take that into account. So one of the practical applications of that is to prescribe training saying, okay, try to find the load where your initial rep is, say, 0.35 meters per second to 0.4. So once you do that, and you might give a rough range of what that might be actually. So that's one of the, I would say, the main hypothesis. It's that the reliability of the load velocity profile. The next one, and again, it differs on the application. There's no one application. There are multiple applications of velocity-based training. So the next application is prescribing number of reps. And the hypothesis, one of the hypotheses is that regardless of the load used, in this case could be 90% of 1 RM, could be 80, 70, the reps in reserve are associated with a certain velocity. So the closer you are to a failure, you're gonna reach that velocity at 1 RM. So for example, let's say you lift 5 reps at 85%. So the initial rep might be 0.35. And then, slower and slower until you hit pretty much the velocity really close to velocity at 1 RM. And as I mentioned before, it's like 0.16 to 0.18, whatever. And the hypothesis is that you can predict reps in reserve from velocity. Again, assuming that every rep is lifted as fast as possible. So these are two major assumptions of velocity-based training. And if these are true for a given individual or a given exercise, this means that you can use velocity start. So you can say, okay, your initial rep should be 0.35 meters per second. And then you need to stop the set at, say, 0.2 meters per second, which is 2 reps in reserve. So that's the, I would say, two major hypotheses that velocity-based training is relying on. And we actually tested that with hex bar deadlift. And I'm not going to say the results, but they're not that great. And one of my conclusions is that we still need to rely on coaching intuition and the traditional stuff. We cannot just replace stuff with a new velocity-based training. And the other approach that's mostly employed by Spanish researchers is to use a velocity threshold. And that means that you do reps until you say your velocity of the initial rep drops below, say, 10% or 20% or 30% or 40%. But I'm not a big fan of that approach. I think it's pretty good also, but it's not greatest because using percentages is biased on the initial rep. So the faster the initial rep, the bigger the buffer. So the slower the initial rep, the velocity drop will be smaller. And again, it might depend again on an initial rep velocity or the exercise and so forth. So that's one of the approaches, but I'm not the biggest fan. I prefer the velocity start and the velocity stop that's calculated based on the individual profile. So I would say one of the two major hypotheses we tested with the design we made for my PhD is to try to test these two hypotheses are good enough to be used in this way. By good enough, I refer to predictive validity. Are they good at predicting percent of 1 RM and reps in reserve? And they are not perfect. Like, again, I don't want to go into details. Oh, yeah. I wanna publish papers, right? So it's not that easy. I mean, we made few. I would say, errors, but we didn't control for, say, tempo. So one of our during reps to failure lifting, we allowed for the individual preference. So if some athletes lifted and hold the weight at the top and then lower it slowly and then explode it again, where some athletes just lifted up, bam, bam, and then lowered it down immediately. So we didn't control for that. So it could be that thing as well, but it's an individual style of lifting. So we had this idea of the ecological validity. So this is what happens in coaching, and if it doesn't work in something that's happening in the coaching without really controlling for everything, then it's not really practically useful. So, we are trying to make stuff that's applicable in training rather than, laboratory using a Smith machine or whatever, making prescribed tempo of lifting and so forth. So we allow for a self-selection of the eccentric phase and the pause at the top and things like that. So again, it's not perfect, but it has this ecological validity that we were looking to maintain, so the research has application to a real life practice.
Oh, right on. No, it totally makes sense to me. I mean, I think I maybe have thought about that myself a little bit. Like, yeah, if you just blasted the first rep versus if you kind of sandbag the first rep, and some people, are better on their second or third. And one of the things I don't want to keep digging into your what you're doing with your PhD. I'll maybe ask a couple more general questions too. It all is really fascinating in terms of the reliability, and especially if we're going to use this and really try to be precise with it. But the studies were talking about the 20% velocity decrement in hypertrophy and fast twitch hypertrophy, and the 40%. What are your thoughts on that, and how we should go about with the decrements and those types of things in general, outside of the validity question?
I think that the main benefit of velocity-based training is the live feedback. It's just, and everybody, once you see the numbers, you're trying to lift as fast as possible. And I think that's a main benefit of monitoring velocity, because you're lifting as fast as possible. And it's been shown that if your intent is maximal, then you're going to get higher levels of strength, explosive strength or whatever. When it comes to those percentages, I would say it's like a quality control. So, like, who said you cannot do less reps with a percent-based training? Well, you don't need to go to failure. So rather than doing 8 reps at 85%, you might do 4 reps. So do you need a velocity-based training device to do that? Probably not. It's like coaching intuition. It's like do 4 reps. So same thing with these percent drops. So if you do 20% drop, that means you're gonna stop the set sooner than with 40% drop. So, all things equal, you're going to do more reps with 40%, allowing for 40% velocity drop. And the thing is, then you're going to accumulate more slower, in quotation mark, reps, and you're going to accumulate more volume. And, research showed that, the volume is probably one of the factors involved in hypertrophy response. But there are also some studies in that 20 versus 40 showing that 20 people lifting for 20 improved the strength quite similarly as 40, actually even better, probably because they accumulate less volume, so they are more fresher. But when it comes to hypertrophy, they had smaller effects in hypertrophy compared to 40%. So again, it's depends what you want. And as I said, having velocity-based LPT, linear position transducer, it's the device that measures velocity of the barbell. It's a good thing because you can, get the live feedback. Then you might get a higher intent of the athletes to lift as fast as possible. But again, you don't need LPT to stop a given set before a failure. You just need to watch it and say, once it gets heavy, stop it. So it's not a big deal. It's just more fancy way to do it.
Yeah, it makes me think just about the, what's the limit for technology use in the weight room as it is, and how much is even good to preserve coaching intuition. I mean, the study with the 20 to 40, you'd imagine if one group just had, hey, you have 4 sets of 5, move as fast as you can. The other group had 4 sets of 12, and you had a coach encouraging them the whole time, there would probably be similar results. It would be a similar outcome versus actually going through and looking at it and just kind of knowing, and maybe stopping a rep if you had to or something like that with on the end of the coach. And I totally agree with the motivational factor. I mean, I've seen athletes who if they're doing Olympic lift and you put a tendo on the bar, all of a sudden you just know that bar is moving about at least probably 0.2 or 0.3 meters per second faster than it was before you put it on there, just because they're motivated now. They went through something routine and now there's an outcome with it.
Yeah, one thing with all this velocity-based training is that if you're in the research, they're comparing the velocity-based approach and as opposed to I would say, let's call it traditional percent-based approach. is, it's similar to a control group versus experimental. You want to make it blind. So just because you attach the device for a given group and they're doing something fancy, you might get a bigger motivation. And then you might get a better training effects. But if you do similar with the experimental group, in this case that could be percent-based approach, then you might get similar effects. So you might also demand, you give a live feedback, and then you might give, you attach device, you ask for a highest, the highest level of the intent to lift as fast as possible. Where somewhere they don't even do that, so they just compare percent-based approach to velocity-based training, and the athletes know which is probably more important. So because they have a device, they have a screen, everybody's yelling, and researchers want to show that this approach is better, and it's all this bias is going to the athletes as well, and we need, as a researchers, we need to control for that. And it's tricky. I'm not saying this is like, it's easy to be an armchair scientist, it's really easy to pinpoint to flaws in the study, and it's really hard to control for everything. But I think at least when it comes to this, it's really important, because then you might say, okay, percent-based approach is worse than velocity-based approach. But then you in velocity-based group, you have a live feedback, you have coaches yelling, you want them to live faster, and so forth. So it's not really, I would say, fair comparison.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Sure, yeah, and how much of that with the velocity tag on the bar is the outcome of the set? I guess muscular versus higher driven, from the brain, and how motivated you were to do each rep versus if research was done and the athlete had no idea that there was a velocity on the bar, just lift and we'll figure it out. How does that all change it? It's interesting things to think about. Mladen, I wanted to actually go back to, I want to make sure we get to this before our time's up today. I definitely wanted to ask you this. I'd read a couple of articles you've written on this. I think it goes back to the periodization element too. And so just talking about like delayed transformation and phase potentiation. And so you definitely get people like Mike Stone and the strength researchers are talking about delayed transformation, delayed training effects. And how do we manage that? What's your thoughts on how we navigate that in terms of moving from one section of training to the next, and trying to, how much setting up should we be relying on in terms of one training phase onto the next?
So I think the basis of the periodization in general and phase, or I would say phase potentiation, but the delayed transformation in particular, is the assumptions of predictable effects. But let's take the really common example is that, how many athletes on the major competition reach seasonal best or personal best? I think there's a study, but if you find it, let me know, because I saw it somewhere. I cannot find it, and I referenced this example a lot of times. So if things are really predictable, then you will assume that high percent of athletes reach personal best on the major competition, but that's not the case. I think it's around 50%, even less, which means that, if you can hit personal best or season best on Olympic Games, that means there's something flawed in, assumptions of predictability of training effects. So, and that's individual sports. You have all this laid out perfectly planned, and then you don't hit the season best, not the personal best. So all this stuff is based on the assumption of predictability, and I think that's a really optimistic assumption. So, and then you also have this, I would say, real life risk of losing your job. So working in soccer, if you say, okay, we're gonna spend, first of all, you have around 5 to 8 weeks to prepare the athletes. And then you have a friendly matches starting from week 2, pretty much. It's not 90 minutes. It's like 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes, and you progress. So then you assume, okay, you make this assumption and say, okay, for the four weeks, I'm gonna kill them in the gym. So I'm gonna increase and overload the strength training, and then once the season starts, they're gonna super compensate, and they're gonna be stronger, and they're gonna be faster. But they keep losing the friendly games, and then someone from the board calls you and said, what the fuck is happening with the team? They're slow, they have heavy legs, they're complaining, we are losing friendly games, the confidence is going down, and you set things for failure pretty much. And it happened to me. Like, it happened to me, I don't know how many times, because you assume things will work as you plan, and sometimes they don't. So just from a risk perspective, I don't think it's the viable strategy to I would say, overtrain somewhere, or to expect the delayed super compensation, delayed transformation. I think it's like a fancy word, but I don't even know if there's any like high level research on that stuff. So and I've been struggling with the concept for like ages, and nowadays I'm more like, what's the least amount of training that push the things forward. It's that simple. Like, what are the basic things we need to do all the time? Just do them. And then it's similar to the bus bench versus the park bench stuff we spoke about. Like with the bus bench approach, you will have a timetable. So you're gonna, like, for 4 weeks we're gonna overreach, and then for the next 4 weeks we're gonna super compensate. And that doesn't work. What happens after those 8 weeks? Like, how are you gonna progress the training? How are you gonna work after that? The season is like 4 months long. It's not 1 month long. So, and you don't have a one peak. But then the I would say the counter argument will be dealing with individual sports. You have a longer preparatory period, and you have few competitions that are few major competitions in the year. But you probably know and notice yourself, like, even if you work with a single individual for like years, you probably know how he ticks like a clock. But you still cannot assume that the same training gonna have the same effects, because maybe last season he had all this nice stuff happening to him, maybe job promotion or results and things like that. But this year you're doing the same training, but he got divorced, his kid is sick, his parents died, or whatever, and then the training will be completely different. And you're not going to expect the same you can't expect the same training effects as you had before. And also the thing is, the thing we need to think about is that every time you push a certain athlete, especially on the highest level of competition, they are going into the unknown. It sounds funny, but they are going into the unknown level of performance individually, and also on the level of the population. We don't know what's happening there. It's like, you can't rely on the studies on student population that bench press 70 kilos. It's like, it's ridiculous. It's the new unknown territory of the human performance. And all these delayed transformation stuff, it's based on the idea of the prediction. So I think it sounds really good in theory, but in practice, I think Jan Lemur, the researcher from France, you probably know him as a guy with the nice infographics. I think he did a really interesting study where they compared two groups. One group did normal training, whatever that is, and one group did overreaching training. And I think they reach, like, long term, they reach the same training effect, training potential, or training results, whatever. So I think it sounds really nice in the books and the theory, and you laid out nice plans. But at the end of the day, it's like doing the important things all the time, and creating overload and doing some variety. And just I tend to say, like, do the best you can, and they do a few prayings and hope for the best. So that's pretty much it.
I could see the team sport versus the individual sport too. I mean, me as a coach, I've spent more time in the individual, and I think I've almost like grown to just be like, accept a more experimental nature in an individual, because you're always just like, you're always trying something in the off season that you hope clicks and you learn more about the athlete. And if you make little errors, it's not as costly as, kind of like what you said, in a team sport. If you you try something with based on predictability, like this is going to pay off, and it doesn't, and then the repercussions are much greater. And I know coaches like talking like Derek Evely about Bondarchuk and just how experimental that guy was to always be trying to find this thing that's going to get me when I do have to be really good versus a team sport. It's definitely an interesting the way those coaches think. It'd be interesting to kind of get those coaches together, great physical prep coaches, great individual sport coaches, and just kind of see how they're thinking in the off season and what are they trying to get in each phase, I guess, if you will, if you want to call it that, compared to each other.
Yeah, I learned a lot from Derek Evely, and we spoke about this stuff a few times and exchanged a few emails. So one of the stuff, and this is quite interesting, that he told me about is that with some athletes he measure like the discus throw or the shot put throw, and then what they saw is that it takes certain amount of training sessions to hit the peak, or I would say peak, but to hit the plateau. Mm-hmm. So, and then he showed that it might be like 20, 50 sessions, and it's quite stable. So if you squeeze those sessions in shorter time span, they're gonna hit this peak again. If Derek is listening to this, he probably gonna correct me or something if I say something stupid. But if you squeeze those in a shorter time frame, you're gonna still hit those plateau in performance, or if you extend it. But that's individual sport. And what they do is to test this, you need to keep things stable. So you don't rotate the exercises, you don't change stuff. So they have really basic planning, like you probably are aware of it. So they have this A and B, maybe C session, and they are quite the same. And they do all the things, like overweight implement, underweight implement, maybe 10 throws, and then do some specialized developmental exercises, and then general exercises, which are the same and quite really light. So repeat that sequence. Then you can, because the sequence is always the same, there's not much changing. Then you can see how much it takes for the, again, shot put or a discus throw distance to reach certain plateau. So once you know this for an individual, then you can expect that on a competitions, right? So then you can say, okay, we have 2 months. We need to put inside like 30 sessions to hit the best possible throw on a given competition day. And I think that works for individual sports such as shot put or something like that. But with the team sports, you don't want to hit the ceiling. So I would rather slowly cook the athlete and progress by making things more random, if that makes sense. So I would say it's a problem of peaking or multiple performance. So with the discus throw, what's the performance? It's a distance, and in the soccer, it's not the distance, it's not the distance covered. It's really more complex. So having a really strict program, it doesn't work. So I would rather rotate things more frequently so they don't reach the ceiling, whatever that is. Hopefully that this makes some sense.
Oh, no, for sure. And maybe we can unpack that a little bit too. First off, you mentioned team sport athletes not wanting them to hit the ceiling, basically not peaking them.
Yep.
And what are the main reasons that you're not trying to find peaks with those guys? I think a lot of people listening probably would be familiar, but just to kind of extrapolate that out.
So most of the stuff in team sports when it comes to planning comes from individual sports. And usually you see these plans like nice laid out preseason, and then you maintain in season. Is like, what the hell are you maintaining? And also what happens after the peak? It's usually the valley. So, and if you hit the highest peak, after that you're gonna hit the lowest valley. And you want this in individual sports. You want this highest peak on the major competitions. But in the team sports, what's the major competition? You don't have it. You have a long season, and you need to have this. I think my ex-boss, Kenny McMillan, called it performance maintenance or something like that. So rather than having a performance peak, maybe like 100 or 90% of whatever personal best, you want to stay quite stable across the season. So maybe hitting 80% or 80 to 90% rather than, to hit the highest. And also, what do you need to hit the highest level? You need to underload or taper. So because you taper, that means you undertrain to become fresh. And then what happens next? Like you need to start training. So because you come from an underload, the next phase is going to be overload for you. And then you're going to, after the highest peak, you're going to hit the lowest valley, and then you're going to have really, really bad performance. So rather than trying to hit the peak at the beginning of season with the team sports, I would rather have less distinguish between preseason and in-season training and have this rather quite quasi-stable level of performance throughout the long competition period. So I would say that's the main difference when it comes to team versus individual sports from a peaking perspective.
Yeah, and it changes everything. It's just like, you got like Simon Sinek, right? Know your why. Like if I'm an individual, why? Well, I have to peak at the max. I want to hit the ceiling at the right time. If you're a team sport, your why is to not have to deal with the volleys, like you said, the peaks and valleys that go with, quote unquote peaking or whatever, because then, injury or other reasons. And so that fundamentally changes the whole process. And I think it's just good. I imagine each camp can learn from each other a little bit in that regards too, in terms of seeing the differences there and what you're trying to achieve.
Oh yeah, physiology is the same. It's like we are same humans, independent if you are playing an individual sport and a team sport. So biomechanics and physiology are the same. We are all quite similar. So all this stuff, the principles of training are quite the same, only the context changes, as you mentioned.
No, absolutely. So just got a few minutes left. I want to maybe leave it off with this just to summarize a little bit, because you kind of mentioned just in unpacking a little bit of the Bondarchuk system and then what you're trying to do. So your thoughts and processes for navigating team sports in terms of, I guess you would say, blocks or cycles, or I know you've talked about agile periodization a little bit in the past, but what are some generalities in terms of how you go about, how far into the future would you train a team or write a team sport athletes program? How is there any sort of delayed training effects whatsoever you're looking at, or is it pretty much just flat line the whole way, really, really coming back to it really quickly?
So it's a good question, and I might need to elaborate a little bit. So with team sports, and I would say also other sports, but team sports especially is like you're always limited by logistics. Like you're not, and by logistics I mean competition, and you need to have some recovery, and you have a lot of athletes and so forth. So at the end of the day, rather than having the optimal training, whatever that is, and perfect peaking or perfect timing of the training sessions, you want to have what I like to call the robust training. So the robust training is something that works in multiple scenarios rather than being optimal in one particular limited case. And in this regard, by being robust is making sure you're doing the most important things all the time, and that means speed work, that means some plyos, that means some lifting, at least when it comes to physical preparation side of things. For example, with Port Adelaide, we had 2 weeks strength training phases because Aussie rules is really physical sport, and you always get some twerk, or you get a cork, or whatever they call it in Australia, maybe in a shoulder, in a quad, and you cannot perform certain exercises. So if you have a long-term plan, it doesn't really work. You need to adapt to it. You need to adapt to a situation, but you still want to hit I would say the major objectives that are long-term, if that makes sense. So when it comes to phases or blocks, so we have this in periodization, the idea of the pre-planned phases. So anatomic adaptation, hypertrophy phase, power phase, and whatever. And at the end of the day, it's like, why would someone who doesn't need hypertrophy go through a hypertrophy phase? It's like ridiculous. And also I had this scenario when you have this laid out plan, and maybe someone is missing for like 2 weeks. Maybe he was on a national training camp or something, and he missed this hypertrophy phase, and then he need to rejoin on a maximum strength phase, and it creates issues. So I would say we still do cycling, but cycling is not cycling in terms of changing the emphasis of the block. It's not biologically based or any fancy periodization stuff. It's mostly based on the available time. So with the team sports, you might have a competition or a game every week, or sometimes even more. And then you have so many time to sneak in developmental workloads. So you might have like a day or two in a week to sneak in something that's developmental. And because you have a lot of stuff to cover, you cannot create developmental workload for all the important stuff. So what you can do from, really, really simple is that make sure that you hit all those important things. I would say that Derek Hansen mentioned microdose. So microdosing stuff, doing a little bit, having this small string or is it string there? Yeah, I would say string of volume for hitting all the major stuff, whatever that is, all the time. That makes it more. That makes the training program more robust. And then you have a little bit of sometimes there's opportunity to overload certain things, and then you are able to do it. And also you might have time and energy limit, and you cannot make emphasis on everything all the time. So you do need to rotate it. So for example, 1 week you might emphasize more conditional games. So you might have 2 conditioning sessions. Next week, or maybe, whatever, maybe you focus on that stuff for like a few weeks and then you switch. Then you might, okay, I'm gonna emphasize more strength training. Now we have opportunity to increase the strength training. We're still gonna do everything all the time, but then you might have opportunity to emphasize strength training. And I would say the basis of this reasoning is that to push certain quality up, you need saturation. You need to saturate that quality. You need to do more of that quality, if that makes sense. So you cannot just do diluted training all the time. You do need to emphasize certain qualities and put more emphasis on it. But just, I don't think there's like an optimal biological rationale behind it. People call it phase potentiation or whatever. I think, again, from my perspective, working in team sports is the logistics. You just don't have time. And the best thing you can do that's more robust is like microload everything and then rotate the emphasis. Again, this rotation, the emphasis could be based on the individual need. So for example, one might need extra hypertrophy, so you're going to do more hypertrophy session. And then someone might need more conditioning, you're going to do more conditioning session. So it's more criteria-based periodization rather than having cycles pre-planned in advance. And also thing is like working as a coach, sometimes you don't even know what you need to do with a certain athlete. It shows up in training, right? So you start working with someone and it's like, oh shit, you can't do that. It's like, we need to fix that first. And I think that's going to get the biggest benefit. So, and you need to discover. You do discover that stuff and it shows up. So you fix one thing, then another thing shows up. It's like fighting Hydra, you cut one head and, 3 extra heads show up. But to deal with that, you need to make sure, on the one side, you cannot jump bandwagons all the time. Just, this is now you're focusing on this. Now you're focusing on that. I think that's the bad extreme. So solution is to balance downside and the upside, I would say, or via negativa or via positiva. So first of all, you need to cover your ass. And to cover your ass, you need to do everything, a little like microdose, all the important stuff all the time. So once you do that, you are sort of covered, okay? And I call it minimum viable training program. So, and then once you do that training program, things will show up to you. So they're gonna manifest themselves. I'm starting to sound like Jordan Peterson. So they're gonna manifest themselves. So, you don't know your athletes. You don't know how they're gonna respond. You don't know, what's gonna affect their performance. You're gonna see things. Things gonna show up to yourself as you coach them. So, you have one stable stuff in training, and then you kind of experiment and see what you can do extra. So it means making sure you're covering all the important bases, and then you invest extra time in whatever you identified as the weak link, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I was gonna actually follow back by just kind of giving you a summary back, but you just did it yourself there in the microdosing the things you absolutely need to, and then just enough of the overload, like a 2 week micro overload of what you need to overload. So kind of like West Side, but not, but just for team sports in context or whatnot. Like it.
I mean, it could be, for example, let's say you're coaching a powerlifter, and you don't know him, so you started coaching him. What you gonna do? So are you gonna experiment with stuff? No, you're gonna make sure that he bench press, he squat, he deadlift. So you are making sure he does that. Okay, then you proceed. You notice that he struggled with the lockout, and then in the bench press, then you might say, okay, you're not gonna ditch the squat and deadlift, right? So you're gonna continue doing that. Maybe he is good at that, but then you're gonna say, okay, maybe the weak link or the rate limiter, and I think that everything everything in training revolves around finding and removing the rate limiters. And finding them is not easy. It's like, catch them if you can, Pokemon stuff. So it's not easy. You need to identify the weak links, and it's not easy. Like, it's really, really hard. So, and they're gonna manifest to your, you just need to watch. So you might start working with this powerlifter, and then you see he's struggling with the lockout. So you might say, okay, we're going to continue doing a bench press, we're going to continue doing the squat, and we're going to continue doing the deadlift. So those are all the major qualities you need to continue doing, right? But then you might say, okay, we might focus on the lockout strength, because I think that's your weak link, and you can get the biggest increase in, Wilks score, whatever, by focusing on the lockout. Maybe you can get extra 2.5 kilos or 5 kilos on a bench press. So then you might have, okay, we're going to microdose, or not really microdose. We're going to continue doing all the important stuff, but then we're going to experiment with doing maybe more lockout stuff. And then you're going to try to do that for like a few weeks. And, maybe you're going to get effects, maybe you're not going to get effects. So, but then you might see, okay, then you fix it. Then the other things. So once you fix a certain rate limiter, the other rate limiter is going to show up. It's not that it's never static. It's always dynamic. So then something else shows up. Maybe in the process he screws up his, low back. Then you need to, okay, what did we do wrong? Maybe, you did too much deadlift. Then, maybe we should do, maybe you should focus on higher reps deadlift rather than, low reps deadlift. And it's a continuous ongoing process, and it's really unpredictable and uncertain. And I would say that I learn more about coaching from other books than coaching books, and like reading Nassim Taleb or Gergi Gerenzer or all this stuff. It's like, how do you make decisions in uncertain world? And, Nassim Taleb has this barbell strategy where, most of the stuff is protecting from the negative events and then investing in the upside. So that will be, avoiding the downside will be doing bench press, squat, and deadlift all the time. And then you try to invest in the upside, try to get the biggest return by investing in a certain, risky domain. And I would say the logic is quite similar in investing. So imagine you have a certain amount of money you want to invest. And let's say you have certain, maybe 5 stocks you want to invest in. And now the question is like, how should I invest in those stocks to get the highest return of money? And there's a lot of research, and I think that's called maximization theory and portfolio theory, like making certain distribution of your assets, your money, but for that you need a shitload of data, maybe 30 years of data, and it's quite tricky. So I would say the easiest investing strategy is really simple, heuristical 1/n. It's like invest equally. But in training doesn't mean like investing equally, doesn't mean investing same time on all the activities. Just is I would say the take home message is just making sure you are investing something in everything that's important. So once you do that, you are kind of safer to experiment. and it's never predictable. So we just need to embrace the chaos, pretty much.
Oh yeah, that's right on. I feel like yeah, I'm in the same boat with you in terms of I go through different phases of life, but right now I'm definitely in one where I'm learning more in the coaching field from non-coaching books, and it's always those are some of the best lessons. So I appreciate that. But hey, I think our time is up for today. I actually apologize. I if I gave you all these questions and you wrote a few notes on them that we didn't get to, but perhaps we can revisit them on another day. And but thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot talking to you, Mladen. It was great to finally I've been kind of face to face, Skype at least, but it was great to sit down and chat. So I really appreciate it, man. All right, that's all for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in with us today. Appreciate having you here. As always, don't forget to visit our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. They have a great blog as well, bringing you the leading edge in sports science and tech. Also, if you have the time and you're not driving and you have access to your phone and you have just 2 minutes right now, I would be so thrilled if you would review or rate this podcast. If you like what we're doing, it's one of the best ways you can help us in sharing the knowledge that these guests are bringing with coaches who will find it helpful. So it's just been a blessing to do this all so far, and it's been a blessing to get all the great positive comments and feedback. So if you can, leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, if you just have 2 minutes right now. Totally appreciate it. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest. Have a good one.